For my IDS project this year, I decided to do a podcast about an adopted man's journey to find his biological family using DNA testing. The process to create the podcast is broken into 3 steps: pre-production, production, and post-production. Pre-production entails script writing and research about any topics related to the story. In my case, that was DNA testing and adoption in the 1970s. Production entails recording all the narration and interviewing the person you're doing the story on, as well as just selecting the general audio sound bites and music needed. So essentially gathering all the sound and audio needed to make the podcast. In the final step, post-production, it entails putting everything together and editing the audio into a podcast. This step entails sound mixing and editing and is essentially just turning all the collected components into a podcast. The challenges I faced beside a condensed timeline was figuring out the elements of the story I wanted in my podcast and which elements I didn't. During the 2 interviews I did, I collected so much information from my interviewee in terms of his life, his adoption, and his overall journey that it was hard to decide what was more important to keep in the podcast. Another challenge I faced was having to edit out background noise from the recording to make the audio sound crisp, because due to COVID, I had to record and interview my interviewees through Zoom, and that is kind of notorious for not always having the best sound. So I had to mess around with the audio a lot in Audacity to get it crisp and clean sounding. In terms of growth, I learned exactly how to produce a podcast and became more fluent in audio editing, interviewing, and sound mixing. My final product is roughly a 10-minute long podcast about a man's journey to find his familial roots using DNA testing. And you can listen to it by following the link in the description of this video. For the most part, I met my personal expectations and my proposal plan because the music was good, the audio was crisp, it was as long as I initially wanted it to be, but the only thing that I didn't really meet was interviewing a DNA testing company because of certain difficulties. This project definitely made me more interested in podcasts, and I hope to make more in the future and on different topics like tech problems and the natural world. It also made me more interested in interviewing and journalism, specifically journalism. So something else I'd like to do to build on this interest in the future is podcasts, documentaries, and films where I can use this skill. Thank you very much for listening, and this was my IDS project for this year, 2021.